I have a lot of slides that I'd like to try to get through to the end in the next 40 minutes. And I just wanted to start by talking about the definition of forest health. And basically, what I wanted to relate was that this definition tends to vary depending on the landowner. Some people are managing their stands for timber, and when they have something like dwarf mistletoe, which is a parasitic plant, in their stand, they might consider that detrimental to their stand because it slows the growth of the tree and sometimes can even lead to mortality over time. Whereas someone who might be managing for wildlife would really appreciate some dwarf mistletoe brooms in their stand because this tends to be habitat for a lot of wildlife, especially birds. So I like to use this broad definition when talking about forest health, and it relates to the ecosystem and the components of the ecosystem as well as human needs, a condition that sustains forest ecosystem complexity while providing for human needs. So here the pictures I'm showing you are mixed conifer stands. It's Loomis State Forest, and it's pretty easy to see which picture is the less healthy stand. The picture on the left is showing you trees that are dead, not only overstory older trees, but also even the younger trees have died off in that stand. And the trees that are alive look pretty chlorotic. They're yellowish in coloration. And just generally that stand does not look good at all. Whereas on the right, we have a stand of mixed conifer where we have these old growth Douglas fir. And in the understory, we do have some regeneration coming in, and we have some pretty lush looking grass. And so that looks like a healthy mixed conifer stand to me. This is ponderosa pine stand type. And again, on the left, you can see that we have a dog-haired thicket of ponderosa pine. Pretty unhealthy looking. There's no understory. And the crowns of those trees are not very lush. And they're very tight, small diameter stands of ponderosa pine. Whereas on the right, we have a nice open stand and lots of understory grasses coming in. The trees look nice and large in diameter, and they have some nice big lush crowns. So this is a dwarf mistletoe broom on the left, and we talked about that in the very first slide. If you have a few brooms of dwarf mistletoe in your stand, I don't consider that a forest health problem. And of course, this is great habitat for wildlife. So, you're always going to have at least a low level of forest health issues in your forest. And something like that is not a big deal. But if your stand looks like the one on the right, where pretty much every tree is heavily infested with dwarf mistletoe, that can be a big problem. Not only because it's going to continue to spread dwarf mistletoe throughout the stand, both in the overstory and in the understory, but also those brooms are very resinous and they can carry fire pretty easily. And here's a bark beetle example. Bark beetles are always in your stand. They're there at low-level populations. They're endemic. And typically, bark beetles, when they kill a tree, they're killing a tree that has been stressed out, and they're basically self-thinning for you. So often trees that get struck by lightning are attacked by that low-level population of bark beetles, and they're finished off. But in the picture on the left, we have an entire stand of lodgepole pine that has been killed by mountain pine beetle. And that is definitely a forest health problem. That is an unacceptable amount of mortality in one stand of trees. In eastern Washington, the major factors that are driving forest health are drought and density. So trees need sunlight, they need water, they need nutrients. And drought, lack of water, is definitely our limiting resource. And density kind of works synergistically with that. The more trees there are in an area, the less water that's going to be available to the trees that are there. And water is really important. It is the most limiting resource to trees in eastern Washington, and it really dictates where trees grow and even how they grow. And this can be seen in our own Douglas fir, coastal Douglas fir. can get much larger in height and diameter than our Rocky Mountain Douglas fir on the interior. And this is, of course, in large part due to water availability. So the more dense a stand, the more competition there is for water, as well as other resources. So I'm going to look at a few specific forest health issues here, and I'm going to relate how infestations and outbreaks can occur in regards to issues such as drought and density. And let's start with bark beetles. So we have a lot of species here in eastern Washington. This is just a small list of the more aggressive species. These species can actually kill healthy standing trees. Bark beetles are really tiny insects. They're about 3 to 5 millimeters in length, the size of like a tic tac. They infest living trees or damage and down trees that are still green. And at low population levels, they really only successfully attack stressed trees. And this is because at low population levels, a healthy tree can successfully pitch a small number of beetles out, whereas a stressed tree cannot. There are 4 stages to their life cycle: the egg stage, the larval stage, in which they go through several instars, the pupal stage, and then from that, they emerge as adults. And so most bark beetles have 1 generation per year, but some have more. Others need 2 years to complete a generation, such as the spruce beetle. And then, of course, there are other beetles like the pine engraver who have 2.5 generations a year in eastern Washington. Generally, the warmer it is, the shorter time it takes to complete one life cycle. So when bark beetles attack a tree, they're releasing a pheromone, which is a special chemical that attracts more individuals from the same species. And they do this because the more beetles there are attacking the tree, the less pitch is available, pitch them out, and therefore the more likely they are to overcome the tree. So you're going to see things like pitch tubes on the outside of the tree. You might see resin flow, or you might see boring dust on the bark surface. These are all indicators of attack. And this boring dust is really a combination of beetle excrement and also sawdust that they're creating as they're getting into the tree. It's a reddish, fine sawdust. Once inside the tree, an egg gallery is excavated and the eggs are laid alongside the gallery. Then those eggs hatch and the larvae feed on the phloem, which forms these larval galleries. And these galleries are actually unique to the major bark beetle species. And so oftentimes when we're identifying what species of bark beetle is present in our tree, we're looking at the galleries rather than the beetles themselves. And so they're feeding on the phloem, which is located right underneath the bark of the tree. And so this is basically how they're killing the tree. The phloem is the food source for the tree. It's carrying food from the needles where it's created down to the roots. And when bark beetles feed on this layer, they're basically girdling. They're cutting off the food supply. Additionally, many bark beetles carry fungi into the tree, especially blue stain might be something that you've seen. And this begins to grow into the sapwood. And the sapwood is the area where the tree is carrying water and nutrients. So trees defend themselves mechanically by pitching out bark beetles that are trying to enter. If a tree is not receiving enough water, this lowers the production of the pitch and it makes it easier for beetles to enter the tree. Additionally, trees are using chemicals to defend themselves. So trees have chemicals in their resin called monoterpenes, and some monoterpenes attract beetles while others repel them. The ratio of these monoterpenes changes with the health of the tree. The graph I'm showing you is the change in emission rates of a monoterpene called alpha pinene from Scots pine over the growing season. And as you can see, during that hot, dry summer period in July, alpha pinene emissions increased significantly. And this is a common attractant for bark beetles that attack living but stressed trees. Ethanol is also an attractant for many bark beetles and wood borers. And during droughty periods, we see an increase in the emissions of ethanol, which then attracts certain species of bark beetles, such as the fir engraver. How about defoliators? Our two major defoliators in eastern Washington include the western spruce budworm and the Douglas fir tussock moth. The most damaging defoliator in Washington, in terms of acreage, is the western spruce budworm. Its main host is Douglas fir here in eastern Washington, followed by brand fir, and it does feed on spruce and hemlock, and during outbreaks, it'll eat just about anything. And these guys are very inconspicuous. The egg mass is located here on a needle, and you can see that it's green and looks very much like the rest of the needle. Very hard to find these. When it hatches, it kind of takes on a whitish appearance. The first instar larvae are very, very, very tiny. And this is the second instar larvae, and this is when they hibernate in this hibernacula at this stage. Then they emerge again in the springtime, and they disperse on these little silken threads. And then they begin tunneling into older foliage prior to bud break. And then as the buds begin to expand, they'll start to feed on those. And you can see there's a caterpillar in here and over here. And then they're feeding on the expanding foliage. And then in early summer, they start making these little tented areas consisting of needles and webbing. And then by the sixth instar, which is the last instar, they're pretty conspicuous at that point and pretty easy to find. And this is usually occurring around July, the first week of July. Finally, they pupate in midsummer, and their pupal cases are pretty typical of a moth. And then they emerge as adults, and they fly actually at night and mate. And they're pretty small moths. They're only half an inch long with the wings closed, and then an inch long when the wings are open. And they have an orangish coloration. So the western spruce budworm eats the current year's foliage only. So therefore, the damage tends to be worse on the younger trees and at the tops of the older trees. It almost seems as if the trees take on a burnt appearance. And defoliation can cause growth loss, top kill, and maybe even mortality after several years of defoliation. And these outbreaks can last more than 10 years. So they can be very devastating. Now, the Douglas fir tussock moth also feeds on Douglas fir and true firs first, and it will again feed on pretty much anything during outbreak periods. Their egg masses look quite a bit different. If you're looking for Douglas fir tussock moth egg masses, you're looking on the undersides of Douglas fir branches from August on. They overwinter in these egg masses. So you could literally just pick these off the tree if you wanted. This is a larvae, and I would not suggest holding it because a lot of people are allergic to those hairs and they get a pretty nasty rash. These are present typically in midsummer. And then they'll pupate at the end of July, maybe through the end of August. And then the adults are present from late July into November. The males are much more easier to identify. The wings, the second wings, tend to be orange, and usually that orange coloration is a lot brighter than what we're seeing here. And the antennae themselves are pretty frilly. They're large antennae. The females themselves actually don't fly, so you will not see wings if you were to actually find one of these females. An interesting thing about the Douglas fir tussock moth is that prior to an outbreak, they begin defoliating ornamental trees. And so the pictures I'm showing you here consist of blue spruce and also AB's cone color, the actual white fir, in people's yards that were defoliated prior to the more recent outbreak that we had of Douglas fir tussock moth. Oddly, even though we're getting these signals that there's going to be an outbreak, and these were occurring in Stevens County, we never know where the actual outbreak is going to occur. And in this case, it was actually over at Blewett Pass and up in the Okanagan. So unlike the western spruce budworm, the Douglas fir tussock moth defoliates foliage of all ages, so trees can be completely defoliated. And their outbreaks are cyclical. They will occur every 7 to 11 years. And so this is just showing you how severe the damage can be. Typically, though, the outbreaks are short-lived. They're only about 3 to 4 years at the most. And trees, which is with as much as 99% needle loss, can actually recover the following spring. So if they've already produced a bud for the following year and they've been defoliated, they might look dead, but they might not be. And you might want to hold off taking down a tree that looks like this until the following spring to see if it does break bud. So defoliators can be very successful during droughty periods because when we're in droughty times, trees start to produce lots of sugars and sugar alcohols in the needles. And because of this, it actually increases and promotes greater feeding in defoliators. So they respond to this increased level of sugar by basically eating more. Additionally, when you have these really dense stands, especially of Douglas fir and grand fir, when the caterpillars disperse in the spring, rather than falling to the ground and desiccating or being eaten by birds, they're able to quickly land on another tree in the understory or maybe even part of the overstory and continue feeding. So the denser the stand, the more easily they are able to survive once they disperse. So in addition to lots of insects, we do also have a lot of different tree diseases in eastern Washington. And this is just a list of diseases that we would see above ground, basically. So this is mainly in the crown. Lots of needle casts and needle blights. Things like rust are very common in eastern Washington. So here I'm showing you on the left what is called red band needle blight. And basically the fungus begins where that red band is occurring on the needle, and it kills the needle from that point down to the tip. And so you get this needle pattern where half of it is green and half of it is brown. And this is really common in the springtime in ponderosa pine. This is rhabdicline needle cast in the bottom left, very common in Douglas fir. We often see pine needle cast. And this needle cast typically affects the older needles. And if you see something like this occurring in your ponderosa pine or logical pine, I wouldn't worry about it very much because it is the older needles. And these will defoliate and it will look kind of sparse after the fact. But generally, if it's occurring like 1 or 2 years in a row, it's not that big of a deal for the tree. This is a lytroderma in the center here, and it almost causes what looks like a witch's brim, very similar to what dwarf mistletoe might look like. But it's really a defoliator, and the needles get infected in this branch every year, and they will defoliate, and they have a tendency to collect inside that broom, which actually makes them a bit of a fire hazard because these brooms tend to hang low to the ground. And of course, Lorch does have a needle cast and a needle blight as well. In one case, the needles are retained and they kind of turn brown to gray, and the entire whorl is killed. In another case, we're just going to see a little bit of striping. Sometimes not all the needles in the whorl are infested, but they will defoliate. And because Lorch does refoliate, it's not usually that big of a deal. The Plodia tip blight is a little bit different in that it's actually infecting the tip of the branch. So it's going to kill the entire tip. And when the Plodia infects tips and pines, you often see curling of the tip, or maybe it looks like the needles had tried to grow out and expand in the springtime, but they just died off. You can often see the little round spores on the needles. And inside the tree, inside the stem or the branch, you might see some staining. Gall rust is also very common, and this affects lodgepole pine and ponderosa pine. And in the springtime, the galls will begin to sporulate. So it almost looks like there's Cheetos dust all over the outside of them. And these spores will, of course, fly and infect new trees in the springtime. And over time, those galls will basically girdle the branch. So you end up getting a lot of branch tips that die once they're girdled. Sometimes you can get infections inside the main stem, and we call these hip cankers. And these are areas where a tree is pretty likely to break. And so you can see how this tree broke down here on the right due to a hip canker. And then, of course, there's our invasive white pine blister rust. This infects any five-needle pine. And our natives, of course, are western white pine, white bark pine. You might see cankers forming on stems that have an orange coloration. You might see some of the fruiting bodies. Often in the branch that gets infected, it will die and it'll begin to flag. And the rust will move down this branch into the stem and infect the main stem. And over time, the tree does have a tendency to die. Interestingly, this rust has two life cycles, one on the actual pine and then one on ribes species plants. And you can find the rust on the underside of the leaves of ribes plants. It looks like an orangish, basically dust. And I think that's why they call it a rust. So tree diseases and density are related in that spores need a humid environment in which to move and disperse. So when you have a really dense stand, you're retaining the humidity within that stand, which really helps the spores move throughout the stand and infect new needles and trees in the spring and the fall. So below ground, we have several different types of root diseases here in eastern Washington. The three that I see more often are armillaria, anosis, and laminated root rot. Armillaria, I probably see 95% of the time. Root diseases decay roots and the tree stem, and this reduces water and nutrients that are taken in. It's almost like what a tree experiences during drought. It also reduces the structural integrity of a tree. So these root diseases spread underground by root-to-root contact of susceptible hosts. The anosis root disease can also spread by spores. So sometimes you get these patches where a tree has died and you have stumps, and that root disease is basically proliferating in these roots, and it's traveling and it's infecting the trees that are growing and standing next to it. So this is a root disease patch over at Sherman Creek Wildlife Area. And you can see that the Douglas fir in the center of the patch have died. And you have a Douglas fir a little bit ways out here that looks like it's beginning to develop a thinning crown, which is indicative of root disease, and also a rounded crown. And the Douglas fir next to it, although the crown doesn't look very thin just yet, you can see that it's definitely getting that rounded top. So these trees should be pretty conical. So that means that that meristem is not growing up, right? It's being stunted by the root disease. And then here we have a ponderosa pine that looks really great because in this case, the ponderosa pine is tolerant of the armillaria root disease. So trees that have root rot often put on a stress cone crop, and this is really a last-ditch effort to try to reproduce and pass on their genes prior to dying. Also, they often have a chlorotic look to them, like a yellowish coloration to the needles. They also have similar symptoms in that you're often going to see blowdown where the roots are rotten. So in the picture on the left here, you can see that the roots, they're still contained. All the fine roots after this tree blew over are evident. Whereas in the picture on the right, you can see the roots are not evident at all. They've been rotten and broken off when that tree fell. And trees that have root disease often fall over in high wind events. And rather than being pushed in one direction, like you might see during a microburst, they're going to be falling in all different directions. And often when you have a root disease patch, those openings are invaded by brush and non-host species. So in this picture, we're flying over a little root disease patch here. And you can see some of the trees are beginning to die along the edge of that patch. It's a little bit of a closer view. It's a little blurry, but look at very, very common of root disease. So armillaria root disease typically infects Douglas fir and true fir here in eastern Washington. Those species tend to be the most susceptible, whereas ponderosa pine and western larch are less susceptible. But I want you to take this with a grain of salt because it really depends on the site. And the picture down on the left here is showing you a ponderosa pine site actually up Williams Lake Road here in Colville, where this stand of ponderosa pine is being infected and dying from armillaria root disease. A good way to determine whether or not armillaria is infecting your tree is to look under the bark at the base of the tree or in the roots surrounding the tree. What you typically find is mycelium, which is part of the fungus, and armillaria mycelium kind of has a texture of latex paint. It's pretty thick and you can peel it right off the bark. You can see right here on the right that this is a ponderosa pine, and this is actually down by Deer Park at a different site. So ponderosa pine can be heavily infected with armillaria. You may also see resin running at the base of your trees. Rhizomorphs are another fungal structure of armillaria that you might find under the bark. And these are the honey mushrooms, the fruiting bodies that are produced by this fungus. And you're more likely to see these in the fall. Anosis root disease in eastern Washington has two types, the S type and the P type. And the S type is the one that you're more likely to see. And again, Douglas fir and grand fir are highly susceptible, while something like western larch and ponderosa pine are going to be less susceptible. But again, it depends on the site. And rather than that latexy mycelium that you're going to find in the case of armillaria, you might find like a creamy colored pore layer underneath the bark. You might find staining in the stumps. And anosis has pitting on the bark layer, in the wood layers, but the pitting is only going to be found on one side of the layer. Laminated root rot is also infecting Douglas fir and grand fir for the most part here in eastern Washington, and ponderosa pine tends to be more resistant. Hardwoods are actually immune, so if you have an issue with laminated root rot in your stand, something to consider would be planting something like aspen or birch in that pocket. Laminated root rot also has pitting, similar to anosis in the wood layers, but in this case, you're going to see the pits on both sides of the wood. The mycelium, in the case of laminated root rot, is a reddish color. And then you may also see staining similar to anosis root disease in the case of laminated root rot. So oddly, during droughty periods, root diseases actually tend to proliferate. And the reason why is, again, because of the concentrations of sugars and sugar alcohols in trees, which typically increase during these periods. Glucose really stimulates the growth of armillaria. So often after droughty periods, we begin to see a lot of cases of armillaria root disease beginning to kill trees. And actually, recently, after this last summer, we have been seeing a lot of hundreds of pines succumb to armillaria root disease down around Spokane and Stevens County in the southern regions. Blue stain is also a fungus that really likes to feed on the sugars that are produced during droughty periods. So, what about management? How do we manage these issues? When you think about trees, think about the resources that they are receiving. So, if you have a really dense stand, there's probably not a lot of resources available. And so, what they're going to be able to do at that point is basically use what they're obtaining, the light, the energy, the water, to just stay alive. When they have a little bit more energy, they're going to begin producing more roots and more leaves because this helps bring in more food and more water. A little bit more energy, and they're going to start producing cones and pollen to reproduce. Even more energy, then they're going to begin producing height, branch, and woody root growth. That way they can pull in even more water and photosynthesize more to produce food. Number 5, diameter growth, that is where the defenses come in, because that's where things like the resin ducts are produced and where monoterpenes and chemicals are produced that can poison insects trying to get in or compartmentalize fungus that's trying to get in. So in a healthy stand of trees, you're going to have trees that are resistant to these issues. So just because you have bark beetles in your stand doesn't necessarily mean that the tree's going to die if it's attacked. Trees can actually defend themselves successfully from bark beetle attacks. And you can kind of tell when you look at the pitch tubes on the bark of your tree. So in this case, the beetle won. The pitch tubes are pink, and this is because there's a combination of not only the pitch, but also the frass, that finest reddish colored sawdust the bark beetles are producing on the outside of the tree. And additionally, there are many pitch tubes on the outside of this tree. In this case, the tube is white, and here too, and the bark beetle has drowned in the pitch. So this tree won, and it was able to successfully pitch those bark beetles out. A healthy forest is also a resilient forest. And so basically, trees are healthy enough to recover from any disturbance. And we know that trees can do this because there are plenty of evidence of fire scars over time in a lot of our old growth trees. Also, we have a lot of trees that have dead tops, but the rest of the tree itself is still alive. And this is a grand fir with strip attacks. And during endemic periods when the fir engraver is not in outbreak mode, they'll just infest tiny little patches on grand fir and produce a tiny little brood that emerges, and the tree survives that. The bark looks a little funky afterwards, but it's still able to survive. So the best way to prevent major forest health issues in your stands is through silvicultural treatments. These are preventative treatments. You want to prevent these issues from becoming an outbreak in your stands. And in order to talk about density in your stand in relation to bark beetles and some of these other issues, rather than talking about trees per acre, I'd like to talk about basal area per acre. And the reason why is because trees per acre is just basically the number of trees per acre. And that's how we often talk about density. But I don't like using this measurement because it doesn't take into account the size of the trees. There's a big difference between 102-inch DBH trees and 120-inch DBH trees. So DBH is the diameter at breast height of the tree. So at 120 square feet of basal area, this is when your stand is considered at risk for bark beetle attacks. And this is really specific to ponderosa pine. If you have mixed conifer stand, you might be able to have a higher basal area. But if your stand looks like this, it might be time to thin it. And you can thin it down to these different basal areas. And pay attention to the crowns of these trees, the diameters, and the understory that's growing in as we go down to thinner amounts of basal area. There's 60 and then 30. So when you open those stands up, the trees really do respond. And when you thin these stands, you want to thin from below, which means that you want to take out the smaller trees, because a lot of times these trees grow up as one age cohort. And when they do that, a lot of the trees that aren't as thrifty get suppressed and caught up in the understory, and those trees tend to be unhealthy. So you want to remove those unhealthy suppressed trees before you remove those larger healthy trees. And if you have a stand that looks like this, obviously you can't thin it like that, because these trees are just going to fall over once they're not holding each other up anymore. So in this case, you can try this mosaic treatment where you're taking patches of trees out. Maybe every 1 or 2 years, cut an acre out, and especially in the case of lodgepole pine, that's just going to grow right back again. And that way you have all these different sizes and age classes. And bark beetles in particular really like, they're really specific to sizes and age classes. So if a mountain pine beetle will come into the stand, it might kill some of these older patches, these larger patches over here, but it's not going to be able to get into these areas. So the entire stand will not become decimated due to a bark beetle attack. So bark beetles, when you thin your stand, it allows for water to be available to the residual trees, and it helps with greater defense against bark beetle attacks. In the case of defoliators, it spaces trees apart so that caterpillars fall to the ground when dispersing. And in the case of those above ground tree diseases, the needle casts and such, the space between the trees helps the humidity to disperse, which keeps the spores from being able to successfully disperse themselves. And an additional benefit, of course, is that it lowers the risk of stand replacing wildfires. The only anomaly is root disease. So thinning does not necessarily help root disease, and in some cases it can actually make it worse because you're leaving all these stumps and roots underground in the stand that armillaria or any other root disease might start proliferating, and especially during droughty periods. And this can result in additional mortality in your stand. So the best thing to do if you have a root disease pocket is to identify which trees seem to be affected by that root disease. And if you're going to thin, you want to cut those trees out and leave residual trees that seem to be tolerant to the root disease. And then finally, some additional management techniques that you might think about are prescribed fire. So this is obviously a tricky tool, but it's a great tool if you can use it, because when you run a prescribed fire through your stand, it burns up a lot of those spores from the needle casts and other fungi. It burns up dwarf mistletoe. And also studies have found that it helps create extra resin ducts in ponderosa pine. And when ponderosa pine has extra resin ducts, it's more able to produce pitch that helps keep bark beetles from successfully attacking. And you also want to maintain diversity in species and age classes. In this picture, this is a mixed conifer stand, and there is a bark beetle infestation going on, and it's killing the grand fir. This is the fir engraver killing the grand fir, but the cedar, the Douglas fir, the lodgepole pine, even the ponderosa pine, they're all going to survive this bark beetle outbreak because the fir engraver is specific to grand fir. So then you won't see a decimation of this stand due to one bark beetle attack. And also you want to choose trees that are adapted to the area, because when you bring trees in that are from another area, so if you were to bring trees, ponderosa pine from Arizona, and try to plant them up here in eastern Washington, they're probably not going to survive very well, because when does Arizona get a lot of its rainfall? It's during the monsoon season, which starts in July 4th. And we just don't see that sort of precipitation during the summer months. And these trees won't be adapted to coming up into our area where it's super dry during the summer. think I'm just about out of time here. So yeah, we're just about done. So I would not suggest watering in your stands because you want your trees to produce tap roots if they're capable of doing that to reach the lower soil horizons. When you water trees, they tend to produce platy roots, in which case, when there's a drought event, that upper soil layer becomes super dry and often kills the roots. So if it's really, really hot, like we had last summer, it's 100 some degrees, I think that you can water during those periods, but I wouldn't continuously water. And also, I do not suggest fertilizing simply because when you fertilize, trees tend to produce more foliage, and the more foliage they have, the more water they need. And it's best just to let the trees, decide how much needles that they need in order to keep themselves alive. And then finally, if you have a wind throw event, if you have fire injured trees or snow damaged trees, you want to get rid of those as quickly as possible so that you don't start a bark beetle infestation on your property. Okay, so I think I need to end there because it looks like we're out of time.
No problem. That was great, Melissa. Thank you. Um, yeah, so great. We have about 7 minutes for questions. And I'll just kind of start at the beginning and go through. So earlier on, there was a question about a photo that you had shown. This looks like a bit of a stem exclusion period. The question was what caused the tree to bend over so completely. So there was a photo of a tree that kind of had bent from the ground at the trunk to kind of touching the ground nearly again.
Right. It was very, very likely snow. Usually, when you see snow trees bent over like that, it's because of a snow event, and they just never recover. I have actually several trees on my property like that right now.
Nice. All right. So Denis asks, we live in the dry ponderosa pine forest around Spokane. Should we be watering our pines? You kind of touched on this, but we can do it again. Pines of all ages. In the summer, if it's really hot like last year, how much water approximately if they should water?
Yeah, yeah, I wouldn't water all the time, like I said, because you want those trees to really concentrate on throwing their roots down as deeply as possible to get down to that water that's available in the lower soil horizons that don't really dry out. But yeah, in the summertime when it's really, really hot, like especially this past summer, I had a specific tree that I water when it gets hot out. And what I typically do is I come home and I run two sprinklers at the base of it and I let them go for an hour. And I actually move the sprinklers around the tree because the roots, wherever the crown of the tree is basically ending, you can guess that there's roots underneath that, and they probably go out even further. So um, you need to move the water around to different parts of the roots in order to really get to all of them. And that's why I'm moving those sprinklers around. But if you have an irrigation system, that's better than nothing, an irrigation system that's not movable. But yeah, I usually ran it for a good hour every afternoon.